5 years in the College of Agriculture as an educational technologist, primarily doing instructional design work in that college. I'm also a student in the College of Education, and this is some research that I conducted this past year on open educational resources through the lens of the technology acceptance model. So in the context that I come from, which is agricultural education, we kind of try to tie things into a national research agenda, and this is one of those instances where I'm looking at a system model and looking at how this unique technological innovation is being adopted. And I find that open educational resources in general really tie well into our land grant mission of extension education, which is where we take research and we bring it primarily to agricultural practitioners through cooperative extension. So my objectives in conducting this research was first to test the fitness of TAM, which is the technology acceptance model, which is a very simplistic model but can become super complicated. I kept it simple here. I wanted to look at the relationship between how people thought about OER and whether they chose to adopt it. And then I wanted to look at distinct users within the group that I surveyed and see if there were some differences between those groups. And hopefully from that kind of look towards guiding instructional messaging for these different educators. So overall my questions were, do attitudes matter? Do what people think about these resources matter when they choose them or not? The other thing I looked at was general computer self-efficacy and whether that had an influence on adoption. And then finally, that element of group difference. So, are you guys familiar with the technology acceptance model? No? Okay. Well, the TAM is built on a few different ideas from social learning theory from Albert Bandura. I had a scholar crush on him for about a year, and it was very, very exciting. But his work's, kind of old. It's evolved over time, but some of the important things that Albert Bandura talks about are how we come to new behaviors. And one of the big things is outcome judgment. Is the behavior going to benefit me? Is it going to make me better at what I'm doing? So within the technology acceptance model, this is identified as something called perceived usefulness. The other thing that Albert Bandura likes to talk about is self-efficacy, and that's like something people are often very interested in. And this is the self-concept, how good I am at something dictates to me whether I'm going to try something new, okay? So I looked at general computer self-efficacy as it influenced adoption of OER. So the rest of the model then goes into a behavioral intention to use, like, do I think I'm going to use this? Do I think this is a good idea? And then finally, actual system use. So those are kind of the variables. What gets really complicated, and this is a widely used model, are these external factors. I've seen models where there are like 20, 30 external factors feeding into perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. I had to dumb it down for myself. I just wanted to keep it really simple. So I only looked at the computer self-efficacy of these individuals. So I ended up with some research questions that tied directly into TAM. This was very, kind of kept things very clean cut for me. And so my hypotheses were really simple, like, does application self-efficacy positively impact perceived ease of use, that sort of thing. And then my prediction there was that, overall computer self-efficacy would translate into a perception that these things were easy to use. That makes sense, right? Common sense. But underlying all of these things was that group difference element, and that was the final question I was looking at. So I ended up having 128 completed surveys. I think about 200 people actually clicked on and got bored. I thought it was a short survey, but apparently it was exhausting. Lots of people couldn't make it through. So the average age was very mature for my participants. The majority were over 40, which, you know, interesting group, but they also were very well educated. I marked these kind of simply, but the B is for someone with a bachelor's degree, M is for master's, and DOC, 29%. So lots of well-educated people. The other thing I asked about was where you worked, and I was really happy to get a good blend of folks from higher ed, K-12, and then in workforce type training environments. So the instrument was a very traditional TAM model instrument. Selected an instrument that was already validated and then kind of rearranged the vocabulary to fit this new technology that I was looking at. So there were 5 items for the self-efficacy, 5 for ease of use, 5 for the idea of usefulness, 3 about intention, and then 2 about actual use. Now, I didn't collect hard data on actual use. I got information that was self-reported on this. I would love to be inside people's computers and find out what they actually are up to, but that's a privacy issue. So, oh well, one day maybe. When I got all my data together, I did a few things. First, normalization technique. I had Likert scale items, and so what I ended up doing was creating percentage scores based on that. And then from that, kind of creating composite scores for each construct that I was looking at. I ran descriptives, which helped me with the interpretation. And when I did that, I was looking at, normal distribution. I had some outliers, and I had some way, way, way outliers. But I decided to keep them because they did not break my distribution, my normal curve. And they were interesting to look at. So the 2 statistic methods that I used was first path analysis, which tested TAM for fitness for this particular technology. And then given that model did fit, I would be able to look at the correlation coefficients or beta weights to look at effects between my variables. The other thing I did was a discriminant analysis. This was a descriptive one. So what I was looking at was describing the different groups. Can't really predict what group you're going to be in based on the data you gave me, but I can describe the groups that I had. So this is AMOS output for my model, which is so pretty, but really easy to use, I thought, given that it dumps in all your beta weight coefficients right onto the model and everything, and kind of a neat tool. So the model fitness did work out, and I ended up using a few different fit indices, but the most important here with 126N was a comparative fit index, which is good for small sample sizes. And I ended up with a 0.965 in that indices, where a 0.9 would indicate a good fit. So that means I got to look at effects between the variables. Yay! So my first question was, does application self-efficacy have an effect on perceived ease of use? And there was a moderate effect. So the other thing I looked at was correlation tables associated with these things. So there was a strong effect between these things, but they weren't highly correlated. So this made me think, what's going on here? So I think there might be a disconnect between perceptions of technologies asked about in that application self-efficacy portion of the survey, and then what people think about open educational resources. Like, there is a difference. my efficacy with email and PowerPoint and Excel, and my efficacy in going and finding resources on the web and integrating them into my curriculum. So that's an interpretation, but something to think about. Ease of use ended up having a huge effect on usefulness. And this is what really drove whether these particular participants thought something was useful or not. And so this was kind of impressive to me, that the design and the navigability items were the main driver of whether people thought this was useful. It was not driven by the content as much as the design quality of the artifacts. So this was very interesting, but it's aligned with past analysis of learning object design characteristics. So I think that opportunities to explore like well-designed, technically elegant OER and educational training settings could improve perceptions of these resources among educators. So the next two things I looked at, the effects were very moderate, and this was feeding into that intention to use from perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. And because of that, because it was just kind of like this soft effect, I think that indirect effects from those earlier parts of the model would have been would have provided me with more information. So it's kind of a point in the model that didn't quite work out within this instance. And finally, behavioral intention to use. Basically, this confirms that TAM works overall. So the model's not broke yet. I thought it would be neat if it broke, but it didn't break. And this confirms, yes, attitudes and perceptions really do matter in a technology adoption. So this begs of us, how do we influence those attitudes? So the next thing I looked at were group differences. And to do this, I completed a discriminant function analysis, and you get factor loadings. And what you look at are primarily like these things that really influence divisions between the groups. So on this first function, the thing that was really dividing groups up in a consistent way was the idea of usefulness. This actually accounted for, let's see, 62% of group variation. So it was kind of a big deal, this idea of usefulness. The other thing that mattered was the application self-efficacy. This accounted for about 21% of group difference. I looked at these two things because that summatively covered about 80% of the variance between all the group membership. So I could kind of start deciding who fit into what group and why. So, can you imagine who thought OER were useful? I had higher ed, K-12, and workforce training. No idea? Okay. Well, it was the K-12 people. They thought it was useful. They thought it was useful to a much higher degree than educators in higher ed and in that workforce training. So my next question is why are these resources so highly valued by K-12 educators? What is it? Are there just these fantastic open educational resources for K-12 educators? I thought probably not. Probably there is a deficit, there's a need, right? And that's demonstrated in the literature and then at the nuts and bolts level of school funding. So the other thing were who thinks that they can use these items effectively? And this was really where my K-12 group split, because I found out who was teaching elementary, middle, and high school. My elementary educators had like the worst self-efficacy when it came to these types of resources. They just didn't think that they could use them in their classrooms or themselves. My 6 through 12 educators had the highest self-efficacy. They thought they could use these resources better than people in higher ed. They thought they could use these resources better than people in workplace training. So I thought this is really a special group, this middle school, high school group, as far as the self-efficacy component in relationship to these resources. And so that's what I'm hoping to look at further as I'm conducting some other research. So in summation, the ease of use is a huge thing here. If things are not designed well, they don't provide that perception of usefulness to the people that are looking at them. So they're probably not going to be adopted. There's an amazingly high regard of these resources among K-12 educators, significantly higher than what I found in higher education and in workforce training. And then, again, what was super interesting to me was that middle and high school self-efficacy. These people really thought, not only are these items very valuable to me, but I can use them, and I know how to use them in my classroom. So what I'm looking at now are feature models that can look between those indirect effects that I was missing, and then examine how OER integrated into teacher ed programs and professional development, and then exploring the integration of OER into K-12 curriculum development. I'm really looking at this hopefully on the lesson planning level of an individual teacher. I want to see what's going on inside their heads. So, questions?
Yeah. So how many were in your original study? How many people did you survey?
How do you mean? Like contacting people?
The groups of people that you showed in your yeah. I'm just wondering how big was your group?
I have no idea. There's no real way. I sent things to different listservs, like Easeofuse listserv, different instructional design groups at different universities and colleges, and so I have no idea how this was, how many people it was reached it, and then, but I do know how many people actually went through the process, and that end was around 120 folks.